However, what we saw is that the Bible was used as a colonial tool ideologically and practically to not only colonize, but to support the commodification of transatlantic slavery. And we'll use another term as well, chattel slavery. Okay. A type of slavery that was not predominant among the other types of slavery that we saw, serfdom and the servitude that we saw of other white indentured slaves, if you like, the Irish and such like, the Slavs. So I want to unpack that a bit, because this is very important, because one of the things that we're accused of as Muslims is we ignore slavery under Islam, if you like. And it's important because a lot of black people, non-Muslims, they challenge us in that regard. And there's always a sort of defensive step that is taken by Muslims of all colors when talking about slavery in Islam. And no doubt some of the slavery that was implemented and enacted was not in line with the dictates that Islam brought to control slavery, which was in vogue at that time. And when I say control, recognizing what was prevalent across various societies in that era, the Quran addressed that. And we see the adorations, we see the enjoining to free slaves, good treatment of slaves. We don't see what we witnessed with chattel slavery or transatlantic slavery. And we often talk about North America when we talk about transatlantic slavery, and we talk about the West Indies. But we've got to understand that the majority of slaves that were transported in that barbaric era were transported to South America, Latin America, large numbers. And you just have to look at the Afro-Brazilians, their roots and what took place there to know that. And that's not looked at. There's some authors who are looking at that and bringing a lot of evidence, but that was far, far, far more than what we saw in North America and in the West Indies, and far more barbaric as well. What am I saying here now? Coming back to the what I said about the Muslims. The Muslims looked at slavery in, and I've been reading up on this as well recently and the past. There were policies that they wouldn't enslave other Muslims. Unfortunately, there were those who didn't adhere to that in some instances, and it was problematic. But as you mentioned earlier on, that in the framework that was established in Islam, we saw those who were enslaved rising to the ranks of leaders of armies, leaders of nations. We saw slave armies, or those in servitude, European primarily, rising to the ranks, some setting up in India, some setting up in Egypt. We saw this taking place within the Muslim faith. That doesn't justify I think the incorrect practices where the individuals were not adhering to the dictates that were there in Islam. They were actually more aligned with what was taking place in some aspects of transatlantic slavery. So I want to say that we're not being apologetic in this instance. I don't think we should be defensive in that instance, but no other faith, no other religion has come with the guidelines and the parameters regarding slavery like Islam has come. No other religion has spoken about the treatment, the positive, progressive treatment of slaves in the way that Islam has done. Now, some will say, well, why did it talk about slavery in the first place? Again, I will come back to the fact. Slavery was in vogue during those eras, across all societies, across all religions, across all cultural mores. We saw in Africa that defeated armies would be enslaved. They would be enslaved. Those who've recently gone and watched The Woman King and didn't know before, they saw it there. Unfortunately, what we saw from that story was true as well, that when transatlantic slavery started coming about, the more dominant African societies would enslave their captors and then trade them for the trinkets and whatever Western imperialist goods were bought to conduct trade with these African nations. So we know that's there. We know that's there. Some bring that up as well, like, okay, black Africans enslaved other black Africans, but there was also a framework and a protocol that was there. It wasn't chattel slavery. It was nothing like transatlantic slavery. So I want to move from that now. So I've touched upon the fact that the biblical narrative was a false one, remains a false one, was used to colonize, was used to justify commodification of blackness, because before then other races were not commodified. The term black became a commodified term for Africans that were enslaved and transported to the Americas. Let's be clear on that. That didn't happen with the indentured Irish. When blackness was brought together as a construct, the demarcation with whiteness meant that the indentured slaves, the Irish who were in North America at the time, had to be demarcated and removed from that realm of slavery, because then it was contradictory. Whiteness, pure, superior; blackness, inferior, subjugated. So these commodifications took place targeting blackness, black Africans in that instance.